every organization, every cybersecurity team out there right now don't want to be too far behind, because then you're at a disadvantage. Your adversaries have better tools. But on the other hand, you don't want to just turn a blind eye and then have something cause a huge impact within your organization, because that's really what's changed, is just the speed and the blast radius with AI. I mean, we had that before. What we're scared of hasn't changed that much, but now it's just the speed and the blast radius that is hard to keep up with. And I don't think that's unique to healthcare. I think that's really across the board. If you listen to people who really understand the problem, everyone sounds a little nervous about it.
If AI has ever made you stop and think, wait, what is happening? You're not alone. I'm Mo, and I'm a security researcher asking the same questions. On Curiouser and Curiouser, we're having open conversations with experts, researchers, and leaders working at the edge of this space, talking through how AI is taking shape, what's shifting, and how people inside the work are thinking about it as it happens. So join us and listen in as the conversation takes shape. Welcome back to Curiouser and Curiouser. I'm Mo. And while this Sandy is not from the Bikini Bottom, she is still very cool. Sandy Dunn, great friend of mine, and just an awesome person to know in general. Sandy, I let guests introduce themselves because I always skewer, and you have such a cool history. So please go ahead and introduce yourself. What do you do? Who are you? Yeah.
So I'm Sandy Dunn, 20 plus year career in cybersecurity, much longer in the computer industry. I can remember when we were encouraging people to upgrade from 1 gig drives to 2 gig drives. So I was on the phone selling computers when we were telling people you need 32 megabytes RAM in your system. So it's been amazing. I got into cybersecurity actually because of a phone call. I had a customer actually call ordering a laptop when I was at Micron PC, and he started telling me about Carnivore, which was like just a really fancy sniffer that I think it was the NSA had encouraged that a lot of people to put at the telephone companies. And I was just absolutely fascinated. And that was kind of my first dip into, oh my gosh, there's this whole other world that I want to know more about. So I got started before it was cool. Before anyone was really talking about, we didn't even call it cybersecurity. We just called it security. And there was a few passionate people that I knew here locally that were into hacking and doing that kind of thing. And that turned into a career within the cybersecurity team at HP, and became a CISO. So now I'm a CISO. I've had several opportunities in different types of businesses to be a CISO. So I have experience in startups, but have done quite a bit of CISOing in healthcare.
Awesome. Cool. I mean, you do a ton. I mean, I remember, I think our first time meeting, you were doing a lot of work with OWASP on like some of the standards writing. You had like the Compass project, which was really fascinating. There was also the AI incident response process, which I think was really big at the time. Still is, right? Because I don't think anyone really has a great handle on AI security incidents, and they keep changing almost every week. It seems like there's not only a new one, but there's always a little bit of variance, just enough where it's like, we need a new process for this. So I think that was really cool work that you did in kind of spearheading these projects and really pioneering some of this work.
Well, so with OWASP Top 10, I kept joining those calls, and I mostly listened for a long time, and they kept talking about all of the different things that could happen with the AI. And I kept looking at it through my CISO lens, which is, okay, now what? So how do I defend myself? Where should I be? What should I be doing right now? And so you're right, Mo. I went to Steve and I said, let's actually create something that helps people get ready for this. And we came up with the checklist, published that. It was really popular. And as you said, I mean, it kind of ballooned into a whole bunch of other different projects, but that's been awesome to be a part of.
Yeah. Again, OWASP is doing lots of cool work. I mean, just around everything. I mean, we're working with OWASP right now on like the agentic skills report. So that should be coming out like by Black Hat. But depending on when you're watching this, it's already come out or it's about to come out. So sorry if for a spoiler, or sorry for being late. But that's another really cool report that's coming out with skills and how things have kind of changed in the supply chain with AI. But you spent, as you said, over 2 decades in not just security, but in just the computing industry. And again, as a CISO at a healthcare company, you've likely seen healthcare data from almost every angle. And, you have to govern HIPAA stuff. You have to deal with PII. And then you have to run all those incidents around them, like when a breach hits or even when builders are creating things with AI, especially in your organization. So with all of that kind of diversity that you've got and all of the new kind of things we're seeing in AI, from note takers and agentic systems to like LLMs that are like really being trained on your patient's data, how do you feel the balance between protecting patients in AI has changed versus like the benefits of enabling AI for their data?
I think every organization, every cybersecurity team out there right now is trying to find that middle ground, which is, you don't want to be too far behind because then you're at a disadvantage. Your adversaries have better tools. But on the other hand, you don't want to just turn a blind eye and then have something, cause a huge impact within your organization. Because that's really what's changed is just the speed and the blast radius with AI. I mean, we had that before. Like, really, what we're scared of hasn't changed that much, but now it's just the speed and the blast radius that is hard to keep up with. And I don't think that's unique to healthcare. I think that's really across the board. If you listen to people who really understand the problem, I think everyone sounds a little nervous about it.
Yeah. I think when we think about healthcare, right, it's just like one of those really sensitive categories. And it's easy to assume that there's a lot of sensitive data there. So like, for example, I'm a big gamer, right? I don't think that like these game companies have all this like really interesting data on me. But sometimes they take in the location of your device, which is very accurate, right? So like, I don't really ever think about it from a perspective of like every time I start up a game, like, oh, they know exactly where I am. But like when I go to a doctor's office, I for sure know that they have like all of this information on me, like from my blood tests to like my pre-existing conditions to concerns that are typically covered by doctors in like our very private and sensitive notes, right? And these note fields in these apps, they're usually just general text fields. There's nothing special, so it's like not protected in any way other than like encryption at rest. So I'm wondering, like, when we start to look at solutions that are specifically using AI over all of this very sensitive data. People know it's sensitive, right? And we think about like the ways that it can be used to make a consumer's life better. What does that risk analysis kind of look like when you do that specifically, like, I guess, for your industry?
Yeah, it's a great question, though. And, keep in mind, like an organization like where I'm at right now, like we never get any of the notes. We would never get that level of detail. And you're exactly right. I think that's, if we were to kind of pull back and understand, how do we actually improve the HIPAA law, it would be to take out any of the, you walk up and you go to the desk and the nurse says, here's our HIPAA laws. And I always say, well, what are those for? Why do I have to sign this? And the poor administrator doesn't even know what it is. I'm sure she sat through training and but it's become just a checkbox. It doesn't reduce the risk. And so, if you look at the 18 different identifiers, it's your name, it's your address, it's these things that are already public. But what people really care about is the things that you mentioned, which is, I don't want somebody, if I went and had some sensitive thing at a doctor, I don't necessarily want that to be public. And so maybe a revamping of it would be, actually identifying what data, we could have sensitive data and super sensitive. And there is what is considered very sensitive PHI, which is anything that you go in for mental health or addiction or anything like that. But right now, there's cases where if you have a breach and it's just a code, like what you went in to have surgery for is a code and that gets leaked, that's a breach. Well, for most of us, like that doesn't really matter. And so I don't know about you, but I get probably 2 or 3 letters a year, to the point where, it doesn't really have any value to me. It doesn't. Yeah, you gave me credit monitoring for the data that's already out there. And that's the other thing, Mo, which is, I don't know if you saw that Doge, they're accusing Doge, Elon Musk. Apparently there was some big database that had every citizen's social security number in it that got, released. And so, like, maybe that's part of it too, which is how much of this data is already out there. Not to say that that's right, but, I think that we keep trying to boil the ocean, and obviously we're not very effective at it.
Yeah. And I think you hit something like really square on the head with HIPAA reporting, right? Like HIPAA reporting is very sensitive. So as you said, just the surgery code is one, just the name is another one. Any of that gets leaked or is assumed to be leaked or is proven to be leaked. It's just like, boom, you've got to now report, right? And the thing is, we can also talk about the case from Doge, but like when you have that much data that is kind of breached again, right? Like you can only lose this data once, right? And then after that, it's just out there. And it's very difficult to like understand, I guess, the risk every time as a consumer. But as an organization, this is like something you have to really care about a lot. That's why I think whenever we see those like, oh, do you have credit monitoring? Do you have, like, I've got it all enabled. But I also assume that everything's breached, and I take a lot of like the stuff on the consumer side really seriously. Because it's so easy to get access to this information now. I'm wondering, like, from a CISO's perspective, you know that this is already a sensitive requirement and it basically gets triggered at a sneeze, So, like, how does that kind of change your sensitivity to these types of frameworks and, like, exactly which ones you pay attention to, which ones you implement, maybe, like, which ones actually matter, right? Especially if you've got to deal with HIPAA basically getting triggered every time you do something new and potentially get breached. Yeah.
It's a great question. And so we talk about it all the time where I'm at, which is, how do we reduce our attack surface? And so one of the things that we've looked at is using synthetic data, and we've got, some great success stories around using synthetic data. And the data, we're not even using the patient data. We're actually creating synthetic data from the patterns of the data. So, I mean, it's not PHI at all. So I think that would be my answer is, understand the problem that you're trying to solve and where AI can help you. And there's probably a better way to skin the cat. And AI gives that to you. I mean, that's one of the really exciting parts about AI is being able to actually do things in a better way, more quickly, that meet the business objectives and may not necessarily, it doesn't mean you're just training every AI model with, sensitive data. There's other ways to solve the problem.
So I guess maybe to flip this a little bit around, right? Again, synthetic data is a really good way to kind of get around using real data and to avoid like having systems just propagate real data everywhere. So then you kind of limit your attack surface. Let's just say we had to do like a little thought exercise here. And if you could go and like rewrite some of these frameworks around reporting and like the HIPAA kind of stuff, right? Like if you had to modify HIPAA in order to be maybe more effective, more impactful, right? And give you more like signal to something's actually wrong here. What would you kind of change in these kind of frameworks to make them less noisy, so to speak?
Yeah, take it away from being a checklist into something that's really effective. And I think that's the frustrating part sometimes as a CISO is you spend too much time trying to pass a framework or, a SOC 2, a high trust, whatever. And it takes you away from doing what, I certainly consider real security. And it's a balance. If you're doing security really well, passing those types of audit questions should be really easy. And they're really the bottom bar of what we want to be doing as security professionals. It's HIPAA is the base. I mean, that's not security. And you've heard that argument before, compliance isn't security. But I want to say that compliance is really important. if you turn it around and think about restaurants, a health inspector going into a restaurant and they come in, every 6 months to make sure that you don't have too much grease and that you're not trying to poison people with, uh, old cheese and old meat and stuff. Well, it's a point in time. That health inspector coming in is just a point in time, but ideally that's the bottom. Ideally, he never catches you when you aren't doing actually really good, uh, managing your restaurant in a clean and healthy way. And I think that we want to look at the SOC 2 and everything like that too, which is, that's the bottom. Like, they're just checking, making sure you're not poisoning and giving people, some sort of food illness. And it is good to have the check and balance, because a lot of times, security is, nobody has time for it. Everyone's going too fast and there's just not enough time in the day. But the other thing I will tell you is really modernizing. I mean, we have an opportunity, especially with AI, with the CICD, the Terraform infrastructure as code. A lot of your auditors are not up to speed. They just don't run into environments that are actually deploying in a modern way. And so making sure that your policy, you don't have to respond to those age-old questions of, tell me about your change management process where you submit a ticket. And I don't know anyone who's done that for the last little while, not how we build software anymore. So making sure that your policy and procedures actually reflect what you're doing, and then automating it, right? I mean, nobody wants to do manual stuff anymore.
That's entirely fair. Yeah, I don't really think any security team wants to go through, like now that we have all these tools that do such good work at reducing the amount you have to view. Like, even this morning, I was watching a live stream. I wish I could tell you the organization that was hosting it. I just don't remember off the top of my head. It was like 6 a.m. But it was interesting. They were talking about like how application security has changed with AI, and they were talking about the program that they were building, and the new focus was around bad patterns made in the design, to look at the design decisions that are made, and then identify any bad patterns that happened after that design decision was made. Right, so like you can kind of trace back these baseline security requirements that you need to establish earlier on. I mean, versus how security has been done traditionally, because you had to use people and you had to use manual time, right? You couldn't track down a bad pattern across your entire stack so fast. You would just have to do it at a point in time. You'd have to review the application and go forward. But now we have like an ability to just review signal at scale, from an incident response perspective. From an application security perspective, you can now really work alongside developers in a way you couldn't before at scale. You can basically build your 3,000 person application security team with agents and have really good signals sent back to the core team. So I'm wondering, now that we have all this signal, all this noise, and we understand all of this, we go back to these frameworks around risk and risk-based frameworks, and really being able to grow and build the security program around risk. But risk has had so many different changes to the language and how it's being framed. Now, we all like to say that there's one easy way to understand risk and it's the same. But with AI introducing new vulnerabilities, I think people get confused and they consistently mistaken new vulnerabilities with new risk. So I guess, do you think that AI is actually introducing new classes of risk that we need to be building our security programs for? Or do you think they're introducing new vulnerabilities that can just be rolled up into a type of risk we're already familiar with, therefore being dealt with by techniques we already have?
I mean, some of it is unique, the non-deterministic nature. I mean, how do you test for something that's non-deterministic? What's a pass? If you get close to the same answer after 5 runs, after 10 runs, there is a lot of what's changed with AI. The fact that prompt injection is unsolvable. I mean, we could, it's a system architecture issue that until we redesign the entire how the systems are deployed. So that's basically whack-a-mole until we figure out a better way to do it. So that it is different. There are a number, the model poisoning. I remember when poison ivy came out, and people don't talk about model poisoning as much as they used to, but it's a real thing. Like how easy it is to actually impact the response in a model. And if someone had malicious intent, how would they do that? So there are new threats, but risk is risk, right? It always comes down to dollars in business, what you're trying to accomplish as a business. And so, I think that we have a great opportunity to actually have a better conversation. AI has helped security teams actually come to the table because people recognize that it's not risk free. And, a security person should probably be in the room, when you're rushing to deploy these kind of things. But I still find a lot of it imbalanced. For instance, note takers. Like everyone has a note taker. And, I hear people talk about, especially in healthcare, not wanting to have note takers internally because somebody might mention some PHI. But no one ever talks about a policy to prevent anyone from joining a meeting that has a note taker. That's not in their control. Verizon just came out with their impact breach study, which I think it's the first year they've actually done an impacts report, which is based on insurance claims. And I think to actually have a good risk conversation, you have to be able to quantify it. I think that was what we struggled with as cybersecurity professionals forever, was saying, hey, something bad could happen, something bad could happen. And then, everyone kind of did their thing. And then the big thing happened. And it took a while. And no one wanted to listen to the person with the tinfoil on their head that said, I told you it was going to happen. But that's true of anything, right? That's true of, there's always someone warning you about, some danger out there. And so how do we actually quantify it? And this goes back to, the Bruce Schneier. He's talked about this for years, the security theater. We all do security theater because that's the only way that we can move the needle. We, come in, you do your slides. You always talk about the worst thing that could possibly happen. Trying to get people to actually slow down and implement the security that that the organization needs. So short answer, that was not a short answer. I think risk is risk. It's always about dollars. How much is this going to cost the business? What's at play? What's the risk appetite? What's the risk threshold? Let's have that conversation. And I think AI is bringing CISOs to the table to have that conversation. Your entire IT should be in the enterprise risk register. I still find cases where people are fighting to, get out from underneath some other category within the enterprise risk register. No, IT should be one of the top categories. Cybersecurity should be one of the top categories in the risk register. And I can prove that with dollars. I can show you the impact. So make sure you quantify it. And is the threat slightly different? Yes, but there's a lot of similarities too.
Going back a little bit, you brought up like model poisoning, and as soon as I hear about that, there's, right now, I think we're in a really interesting space, or at least time in the space, where open source models have gotten a lot of really good attention, right? There's been this trend where open source has kind of followed flagship for the longest time. And most recently, the flagship models have gotten really, really good, really good. You look at Fable and it's wow, this is incredible. You look at the newest releases for ChatGPT and you're like, oh man, these are insane, right? And then you go and you look at GLM 5.2 and you're like, okay, this is really good, but also it doesn't cost you anything to run, right? Especially if you can host this locally. But these open source, open weight models, right? If you look today, there was the Hugging Bed that was released, right? Which is going to basically be a P2P network of hosted models, right? These things are huge, massive, difficult to download. And yes, you can get them off of Hugging Face, right? but there's now this other place where you can get them, right? So now you have to wonder, okay, well, like what type of biases are kind of preloaded here? You don't know how people are modifying their models, right? Like,
and it's impossible. Like it's mathematically impossible to actually know what went in there. Are you could even, hopefully they have a system card, but how do you verify it? And I know there's been a lot of discussion around that. But with the Chinese models, I was just reading a threat report this morning, and they found all sorts of backdoor and some networking equipment that, was well hidden. So, it's a tough problem because I wouldn't be comfortable running a Chinese model just because I know, I've just seen too many bad things.
Yeah. And like we said, every model, all open source models have their own kind of issues. And we know that models coming from outside of the US, they have a bias already baked in. And I think this is where things get difficult because these models are so cheap, so useful to run, right? And we do our best to remove the biases in these models to make them more usable in an internal environment, right? In your specific field, and I cannot think of a couple of other ones, but specifically with patient history and populations.
We never do. Yeah, we know. Right. Yeah, we would never touch that data into it. We would never put that in it.
Yeah. Is it too much of a liability risk? Do you think that's like the real main issue there?
It's just not useful to us. To your point, and I'm glad I'm not at an organization that is wrestling with this. It would be very difficult. Like, I don't know where you got the data, but most organizations are, they're very strict about what you do with their data. There's these very long, contracts that tell you what you can and can't do, to the point that, even if you train a model, they say that they own, the synthetic data that you created with that model. Now, again, that's not how we do it. But I'm glad that I don't have to worry about that. But, think about that, Mo. Look at all of the models that we use, Claude, ChatGPT. They trained on your data, on my data, on everybody's data, before anyone really knew what they were doing, that they were just scraping all of this. Like, maybe it doesn't even matter what data goes into a model because they have it all anyway. And I know that I don't want to be flippant about it, and you see where people are like, well, you can't have any of our data. Like, you can't use any. And you're like, well, we're actually trying to, you benefit. Here's the thing, this is still very new. Back when was it was it 22 that ChatGPT?
22 was the mainstream moment. Yeah.
And I can't believe it's been 4 years, but nobody looks at your Google Maps and says, hey, how do I know that this AI is trustworthy and stuff? They did in the beginning. Remember when people were like driving up bridges and going into lakes and stuff?
Yeah.
So it's possible that as we get more comfortable with the technology and it becomes less artificial to us, it just becomes intelligence, that there's less scrutiny around it. Like, there's more trust. I've never really thought about it. How do they do the Google Maps? Well, why do we trust that now?
Yeah, some of it is just adoption through use, right? You see a lot of people in the crowd use it. And I don't hear people actually say, oh, I Googled this anymore. It's like, oh yeah, I asked ChatGPT, or oh, I asked Claude. That's the new thing, right? The more people that adopt it at scale, the more assumptions that we make as consumers, like, oh yeah, well, if a lot of people are using this, then it must be good. And that's, one of the big things that we look at in our day to day is okay, well, how can you trust your AI when we know that not all data out there is good? For example, there was this funny anecdote that I was listening to on a podcast, and they were talking about how there were 4chan forums and threads on what an AI apocalypse would look like. And the only reason why AI knows how to be violent or how it would take over the world is because we've literally written scenarios about AI taking over the world, right? And if you've got this super intelligent model that is trained on all of human writing, guess what? It's going to have these edge case scenarios and all these crazy things in there as well. So, that whole part where we talk about training data and diffusion and bias at scale, continuously goes down, like you see less bias as you include more data. I would actually think that
Is that
a
true?
lot of, I mean, that's like how you would kind of mitigate certain risks when it's associated with LLMs. So, for example, if you're doing like a user study and you're using a certain LLM, you might actually want to include more data from more populations, or you'd want to use various LLMs to see the results from multiple places.
Have you ever read any of Brian Christensen's books on the alignment problem?
Mm-mm. Tell me more.
Or Melanie Mitchell is another good one.
Okay.
I mean, the funny thing is everyone's an AI expert, and I always feel bad for people like Brian and Melanie who like toiled in the darkness and nobody cared about what they thought for decades. And now everybody else is an expert. But Brian's written some really, really good books, about, some of the challenges, but things like, a lot of the medical data, they use white men. And so women are underrepresented and people of color are underrepresented. So is adding more data to that, is that going to solve that problem?
In a theoretical sense, it should. But if we think about how historically data has been collected, right? Like as someone who's Black, like one of the big things in the Black community is that we've seen like health data be very inaccurate when it comes to our population, right? So LLMs are completely trained on this type of data. And we had a really great episode with Tanisha Martin. And it was really like, we talk about like how data inherently, the way that it's been collected is kind of biased, right? So we are left with results that tend to be biased. However, if we have biased data that we know is already in the population, how do you kind of mitigate that, right? You kind of have to validate that data, make sure it's actually true, right? But then how do you know that the validation source is able to do it correctly? Unfortunately, the bias problem is so hard to solve at scale. Right now, I think most of the solutions have been just scale it up. And eventually, over a time set, you either understand what the bias is exactly, or there's so much data that you can start to make assumptions that it's less biased than it was before, because you've collected it from enough different sources, or you're using enough different LLMs to kind of process it. So like it's essentially the bias of every single LLM, and you can't really tell by the end, right? All of the solutions to bias are very difficult to handle, and even the ones that are the best ones that are doing validation on the end of the data, it's still very expensive to do,
When in Dolly, one of my first experiments was Dolly, is I had it create an image of a white blonde college professor with a white horse. And then I added, and it came out, kind of a cute blonde lady with a white horse. And I added one word, cybersecurity, and she came out looking like a witch. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, just by adding that one word. So I think we're violently agreeing that we're just starting to understand the complexity of this problem, and trust is, it's very powerful. It's just like a stick of dynamite. If you need to clear pores, get a stick of dynamite. But you got to be very careful because you can do a lot of damage with it. And I think that's how we have to think about AI, which is you better understand what you're doing when you're holding the dynamite. Yeah, you can do some really cool stuff and move a mountain, but you want to throw it the right direction.
Yeah. And, the big thing about trust, especially when we look at like the fields that are most sensitive and most highly regulated, especially healthcare, I think that trust is actually the biggest thing in healthcare. Whereas we already like kind of don't trust banks just as a society. Equifax has trained us really well to just not trust financial institutions. That whole hack was, I think the big moment. But when we think about like a doctor's office, like I walk into my doctor's office and I talk about everything freely because I trust my doctor, right? So there's this big element of human connection that exists in the healthcare industry where I don't really think about my doctor using AI, but I remember one time I did go in and my doctor asked ChatGPT something, right? So it's like and again, I'm in the Bay Area, so I feel like over here it's normalized. It may not happen everywhere, But like you think about that and it's like, okay, well, like what happens to the human connection when we start including AI in like these sensitive workflows, specifically in places where like the human connection is highly valued, like a doctor-patient relationship, you know? How does that kind of change how we think about it? And maybe like even where AI is being implemented in healthcare?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mo. I think if you talk to doctors and nurses, I have two nurses. Both my daughters just graduated, so I get a little inside perspective on this. But um, they're so burdened by paperwork that they're not having fun either. Like most of those people, I am so impressed with the healthcare industry, how they train individuals who come into it. So I will absolutely say my experience watching both my daughters go through it. I wish we had something similar in cybersecurity. Like it was the mentoring, the job exposure, like they really do a fantastic job of bringing young people into careers within the medical community. But we all know that people get burned out. What I don't think people get burned out taking care of people. They get burned out with friction. And it's the same thing that happens with us. And, most of us love what we do in cybersecurity. We love what we do. What burns us out is if we can't solve the problem or, there's too much red tape and everybody keeps slowing us down. That's what wears a person out. And I think it's the same in healthcare, which is we've made that a very difficult job, mostly because of things like HIPAA, mostly because of paperwork, because systems don't talk to each other. It's so hard to trade data. They're burdened by, the insurance stuff. I actually was just going through and trying to figure out, that my different options for a dentist. I read the material and I could not figure it out. And I threw it into Claude and Claude explained it to me. And I was like, so why did I have to take that extra step? Why did I have to go to Claude to get some clarity on this? Why can't they just write this so a human can read it? And so I guess, I'm Sandy Sunshine, so I'm always optimistic. I think we're definitely in the frontier. Everyone's experimenting. Everyone's trying to figure out where this AI, helps us be more effective. And my real hope is that it does free up people's time that, and I'm sure this has happened to you. Like I've had nights where I stayed up all night. I was so into what I was building, whether it be Cursor or Claude, whatever, like literally stayed up all night because I was just so into whatever I was building. That's pretty fun. That's fun to be that enthusiastic about something. So I think, it's definitely a stick of dynamite. The next few years will be interesting. We talk about frameworks and governance. I think that's a really challenging problem because our legal system was never set up to move at the pace of cybersecurity. At plain networking, at the pace of technology, our legal and regulatory system was not set up to keep pace with it. And now we add AI on top of it. So when people start talking to me about AI governance, I just go, I don't know. I don't know. So, maybe that changes. But I think the next decade is going to be absolutely compelling.
Yeah, there's a lot that I can say about that. Like, the last CISO I worked for basically invested a lot in GRC because he was like, GRC is where we're going to see the most change in cybersecurity. GRC teams are usually, the business connectors for the security department, right? If you can enable them at scale to be as proficient in application security as your AppSec person, right? You enable them to communicate technical risk a lot better at higher levels. So the GRC engineering function that has kind of emerged in the last 2 years has been kind of insane to see grow. Now I'm hearing about GRC engineering teams almost at every conference where these GRC teams are becoming really technical at how they're able to assess AI solutions, how they're able to like very quickly understand risk, how they kind of build their own internal frameworks for dealing with new AI products that are coming in, with new things that are being built, how they kind of enable application security teams and infrastructure security teams, just the security organization in general, to operate a lot faster. They don't take the place of like your AppSec team or your cloud security team, right? They're not specialists. However, AI was always made for a generalist, in my opinion. And if you are good enough at understanding the frameworks and you have just enough information about all of the different areas of security to be, I would say, good enough to have a conversation with, you can use AI to fill in some of your knowledge gaps and use experts around your team to kind of grow really fast and get ahead of governance before it becomes a problem. And I think that's kind of where we really have to grow into. It's how do we enable the business at scale to adopt AI? And as it's adopting AI, how do we understand these risks at scale in context to our business? So, when we think about or at least when I think about some of the healthcare risks, right? A lot of it just comes back to the human factor, where it's like, okay, like you said, we need to reduce the amount of friction that it takes clinicians to actually treat humans, because that's the work that they get done, that they do the best, right? And the initial place is triage and customer service and first line of the first point of contact for a customer. Like, imagine an agentic AI system that is used to do that, first line of contact, that misreads someone and says, "Oh, you're fine," when they're not, right? And I think this is where I get a little bit worried, because again, this is an AI solution that we deployed that we aren't sure about. We have to monitor all these things, but this outcome is the exact one that's dangerous to humans, right?
You know what? I would take it in a heartbeat. I hate going to the doctor. You go in and it burns so much time. They treat you like they're doing you a favor, even though then they're charging you for it. Somewhere along the way, the whole system got broken. They just released a doctor kiosk in China. Did you see that?
Mm-hmm.
I'd go in a heartbeat. If I had the choice between a regular doctor or a robot doctor, I'd go to a robot doctor in a heartbeat. I would rather go to a robot doctor.
I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think China also has a very interesting way that they manage the population's data, right? So they, by default, have a more consolidated data infrastructure and are able to collect data about the entire population faster. So I think those types of health systems are really well informed, and they will likely be able to give better results. Again, this mainly comes from a data consolidation point when it comes to China. So it's not necessary, it's not, I think, something that we can get to today in the US or even the EU.
Look at what happened with 23andMe, all the DNA testing and everything. So, initially it was sold to people as, hey, wouldn't you like to know a little bit more about your family tree? Well, next thing we know that these people are, they're understanding their databases and their family trees. And the Golden State Killer got caught because I think it was a great aunt submitted her data and then they were able to match it. So yes, do we want the Golden State Killer off the road? Absolutely. So basically everyone in the United States today, it can be identified because the database is so large. So if you leave your DNA anywhere, I didn't sign up for that. And think about photographs. Anywhere you go, think about all of the license plate readers that are out there. There is a lot of decisions being made for us kind of subversively without full visibility, that we all don't understand the long-term consequences. China was very much into pre-crime analysis, and that becomes, if you're any kind of a weirdo, and I label myself that way. If you're different, all of a sudden I don't fit the pattern and I'm getting someone's accusing me of, being different than everybody else and I get put in a different bucket. That's terrifying. And I think that's what we're scared of. We're not scared about, somebody finding out what my blood type is. We're scared about what they do with the data. What's the long-term goal with the data and how could it be abused and misused against us as individuals?
Yeah, I think that's going to be it's going to be difficult to see. And it really just depends on how the space grows. Like we're seeing a lot of, new startups coming along every day. A lot of them are very, very small and agile, right? And they're filling spaces. They're filling gaps where incumbents haven't been able to traditionally move. And I think it will change ultimately how like software is built. It will likely change how people start to interact with different technologies and, in different industries. So, like Lovable is a great example, right? Where people were using Squarespace or they were using like GoDaddy to go and build websites. But, even to build the website was tough. You needed to use WordPress. You needed to go through all these different frameworks, right? And now you have like this one-stop shop where everyone is building apps. I think will.i.am, the rapper, is, he's the number one user of Lovable. So, yeah, isn't that crazy?
I'm building stuff I never thought I could build, and that is super fun.
And it's going to enable us to use data in ways that we didn't think that we could. And, you can ask Claude to go run analysis on different types of data, right? You can basically say, I don't understand any of these patterns. Go find a pattern for me. And it'll find a pattern. And then you can go down that rabbit hole and hope that like at some point it's not hallucinating and you're not accidentally seeing patterns you shouldn't. But you likely will find something that is interesting enough and you decide to say, you know what? I think there's something here. And then you can go build it in the same day. When we talk about like how data is going to be used, I think it really just depends, right? It really does depend on the time of day and what's already out. And, for an organization that is testing these things every single day, especially whether you're in healthcare or finance, you're going to find new emergent use cases that are so specific to your industry and so niche that, it might scare somebody. It'll scare someone everywhere. There are a couple of, right now there's a lot of financial products coming out that do like kind of stock picking for you.
Right.
So if you say, I'm really interested in, the electric industry or, solar, it'll go and it'll put together a small portfolio. Oh, this is your risk tolerance. Perfect. Well, look at all these companies. These are all the trends and patterns. Maybe this will be interesting over a 30-year horizon. So who knows when the next thing comes out and it's just like, oh, well, like this is what you're doing today with your health. Well, you're going to die in like 20 years. Like, I don't think I want to know like what I'm estimated to die based on my health patterns, but who knows what someone's going to do with that. And they're going to say, you know what? You should probably work out like 3 times a week for 20 minutes on a treadmill and you'll extend your lifespan a year. I mean, I wear an Oura ring every day. Like I can imagine feeding this data into Claude with like some of my blood test results and being like, hey, tell me more about like what I look like from a health perspective. How am I doing? And
I think
it gets scary. Yeah.
I've probably told you this story before. My good friend Jay Radcliffe always talked about a story when the Apple Watch first came out. They gave it to a bunch of senior citizens because they wanted to track their heart rates. And to me, this is a classic example of what we need to be worried about. It's the stuff that's not obvious. So they gave it to a bunch of senior citizens, and all of a sudden about 9:30 every night, they saw everyone's heart rates. There's patterns of all these heart rates spiking up, and they didn't know if it was a problem with the watch, if that was what they were feeding them. It typically wasn't every night. It was sporadic, and they were trying to trace and understand what was happening. Well, of course, these older people, so they were getting busy. And, if they would have been so horrified if they knew that a security researcher or a researcher could pull all of that data off of the watch that they were wearing. I think that's the question we want to ask ourselves is what are we giving up about ourselves that we aren't thinking about? And, if you watch true crime at all, I mean, it's all about where they go and pull the data from. And they pull it from watch. Somebody tries to burn down their own house and he's wearing a pacemaker. They're pulling the pacemaker out and tracking patterns, if you're wearing any kind of a tracking device. So all of it's, we're being tracked every day. So, if the question is, should we be worried about how much data as individuals that we have about ourselves that could be abused? Yes. Do we have any way to control that? I would say we don't have a good handle.
I think that's a good place to kind of end. Maybe. Well, yeah, I mean, we're going to have to, but it's it's just a silly topic to end on, but it's also a serious one. Okay, so Sandy, where can the good people find you? Where are you going to be next? Are you going to do anything fun?
It's just, I'm here. I am heads down working. I mean, I haven't even, if you would like to reach out to me, if I've said anything that you're interested in hearing more about, probably the best place is to find me on LinkedIn, send me an invite.
Well, cool. Then I guess we'll see you next time. And I will be at Black Hat and I will be at DEF CON. We're doing like a podcast thing. We're doing a live podcast recording. So if you're interested in that and you want to show up, let me know. I guess that's it then.
All
Sandy,
right. Thanks
for having
me.
Yeah, thanks for coming through. So stay curious, everybody, and have a great and safe rest of your day.
If this episode helped cut through the noise, like or subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Thanks for spending time with us. Until next time, stay curious.